So it's my great pleasure to invite here on this episode Tony Juniper. I've known Tony, I've known you for about 22 years actually, but many people may not know you, so I'm going to quickly break down who you are. But before I do that, I must say that I love your background. You look like you're in the middle of Sweden somewhere and there should be a polar bear outside your back window.
Yeah, if only. If only. I'm in the middle of Cambridge, David, and lucky enough to have this little converted shed at the bottom of my garden where I can do a bit of thinking and working and writing. And during the lockdown, it's been a godsend really to be able to walk through a garden to come down here, even if it is only 20 yards or whatever.
You know, how have you been finding lockdown? I mean, how has it been for you?
So my life before this was very much one of going to meet people, to go and speak at events, to be able to be out having conversations with our partners at Natural England, talking about conservation in the field with farmers, estate owners, conservation groups, local communities. And of course, all of that has stopped. And so everything now is on Zoom or the telephone, and one walk a day is what we're permitted. And I try to do that in ways where I can at least see some wildlife or have a chance of seeing some. So like everybody else, really, it's a big change. But I'm acutely conscious of how fortunate I am in having a garden, at least, and some green space nearby, because not everybody has got that opportunity. And I think actually one thing that many people are realising is just how good nature is for our well-being during the course of this lockdown. And you know, the therapeutic effect of birdsong, being able to walk amongst trees and by rivers, this is something that I think is becoming more apparent to people. And hopefully, you know, if there are any silver linings out of this crisis, perhaps it would be a stronger relationship with the natural world for many people.
But do you think that's going to be a lasting one? Because look at our track record, you know, we suddenly think, oh my God, and the moment we can go back to things that are normal, we just forget. Or do you not think?
Yeah. Well, this is, I think this is an unusual situation we find ourselves in. I don't think any of us have ever been here before. And so I think this time, you know, compared to previous moments when we've had cause to reflect on our priorities as a society, you know, it has been too easy to go back to how things were before. But I think this time it will be different. And not least the very fact of using this technology. I think a lot of people who commute to offices, they might well be thinking after this, well, do I really need to be driving my car backwards and forwards or catching a train backwards and forwards 5 days a week? Maybe I could be doing it for 2 days a week instead. And, you know, that would then have major implications for our transport policy and the extent to which we build roads compared with, for example, installing broadband to those parts of the country that still don't have it. So I think there will be some major implications out of this particular episode, and some of them I do hope will be positive implications, because you know we have some major challenges on our hand as a global community in terms of the climate crisis and the nature crisis, and so being able to reflect on what the future looks like, because we will need to do things differently, then maybe there is something there that we can be optimistic about. I certainly hope so.
That sounds fair enough. Now, let me introduce you to the Zoomers here, and for anyone else who watches this in the future, Tony Juniper is a hugely respected member of the environmental world. And as I said, I've known you for over 20 years now, and we'll get back onto that in a second. But you are a British campaigner, writer, sustainability advisor, and environmentalist, of course. And you served as the executive director at Friends of the Earth, England, Wales, and Northern Ireland. And you're vice chair of the Friends of the Earth International, and there's a whole ton of other things you've done, which I won't go into because there's so many. You've done a lot of things. You are a man that, you know, obviously has a lot of interests all over the spectrum, really. What is the area that you most enjoy being involved with?
I think at the moment the most rewarding part of what I'm involved with is the planning of a nature recovery network for England, looking ahead over the coming decades. And for the first time in my career, really feeling as though we might be at a point where we're starting to really reverse some of the declines that have been so well documented over so many decades. And the idea of bringing wildlife back rather than simply trying to slow down the decline, it is a different feel to it. And the work we're doing at Natural England at the moment in trying to pull together some coherent plan whereby nature recovery can be taken forward at a strategic level across a wide range of policy areas, I'm finding that hugely exciting. But of course, you know, it's complicated. It's an uphill battle. Not everybody's convinced. And so the work is as demanding as it ever was. But I do think, because of various things that have happened over the last decade in particular, that people are beginning to realize that, you know, nature isn't simply a nice to have. It's essential for our health, wealth and security, and the extent to which we invest in nature's recovery, you know, will bring a number of benefits to society, ranging from, you know, reduced flood risk, catching carbon, being able to improve tourism industries, being able to improve people's health and well-being, and ultimately even our food security. And so I think that penny finally has dropped. And so we're getting into a position now where there is much more consensus and much more energy toward this big idea of nature recovery. And so where I sit in Natural England, that's one of the roles I have these days, takes up most of my time, I have to say. You can feel that things have moved compared to where they were in the not too distant past. So I'm quite encouraged by all of that. But as I say, you know, there's a great deal of work to do, and we may not win, but we will do our best to be able to take some of these big ideas forwards.
Yeah, well, as you said before, just now, you are involved with Natural England. You are in fact the chair of Natural England. And for those who don't know what Natural England is, it's a non-departmental public body in the UK, sponsored by DEFRA. I'm interested in this whole idea of the Nature Recovery Network, because that sounds quite fascinating. What species in particular are you talking about? Are you talking about the sexy species like lynx and wolves, or are you talking about what's happening at the moment with white storks and white-tailed beavers?
So it's kind of happening at multi-levels at once. And so the recovery of rare species and the reintroduction of ones that have gone, this is certainly a part of the overall thinking. But the main idea really behind all of that is to be thinking about landscape scale restoration of natural habitat. Because if we don't have large areas of natural habitat, then bringing back some of the animals you mentioned, and indeed many others, it's really not going to be possible unless we can begin to reverse the fragmentation of habitats across the country. And so most people will be familiar, I'm sure, with the idea of sites of special scientific interest. We have several thousand of these across England, covering about 1 million hectares, about 8% of the land area. But a lot of them are pretty tiny little isolated patches of woodland, wetland, grassland. And being little tiny isolated patches, they are prone either not to have their full complement of species in them, and even if they are still pretty rich, they will lose species over time. So repairing that disconnection and implementing the findings of the Lawton Review, which came to some conclusions similar to the ones that we're now driving forward with 10 years ago. Basically, Sir John Lawton, in his groundbreaking report, said that we needed more protected areas of better quality that were connected to one another and operating at landscape scale. And so you can just see some glimpses of where this is now beginning to happen. So in March, anybody listening can look up the Purbeck Heaths National Nature Reserve Declaration. And this was, for us, a major step in designating what is the country's first super national nature reserve. And so if you look at maps of Dorset in that region, you can see an area of national nature reserves, different areas of national nature reserve that previously were disconnected from one another. And what we've done through working with many partners, including Forestry Commission, the National Trust, the Rspb, the Wildlife Trust and others, we've effectively put a new boundary encapsulating the 3 individual national nature reserves that were in there before, but within a far larger area of connected habitats, of wetlands, of woodlands, of heathlands, and into that area of habitat. I'm hoping that in the not too distant future, we will have the reintroduction of animals, including beaver. And so this is the kind of ambition that I'm hoping that at Natural England, we can begin to roll out more broadly across the country over the years ahead. But as I say, this is complicated. It's sometimes quite slow. But the fact now that we've got several examples, and not just the Purbeck Heath, but others, I think is a really encouraging moment. And of course, in parallel, we have various people showing leadership on the rewilding agenda, including what's going on at Net Castle, where, you know, this year, for instance, they have just hatched the first wild bred white storks in this country for several hundred years. So you can see change is afoot, and the ambition is growing, and I'm hoping that over the coming years we can put real momentum behind that. But of course, we've got this crisis that we're in now, and there will be questions on the far side of this as to what priority society is going to put to nature recovery. Do we go back to business as usual, or do we really go with some ambition for this idea of rebuilding lost ecosystems?
Where do you stand personally on reintroductions? Are you wholesale, you know, in favour of them, or are there certain species you kind of have a question of a person?
My instinct is that we should try and bring back as much as what we've lost as we can, because, you know, one of the things we learn from ecology is how everything is connected to everything else. And, you know, the beaver is a really great example of this. You know, they're an aquatic rodent, but they have a profound effect on river valleys and the ecosystems in river valleys, to the point where a whole range of other biodiversity benefits when those animals are back in nature and doing what they do in terms of their herbivorous habitats, their creation of dams and ditches, the way in which they create wetlands. And not only do they bring huge benefits for biodiversity, they're also, in some catchments, able to reduce flood risk. They clean up river water, and in their dams, they collect a lot of pollution that otherwise would flow downstream. So they're providing multiple benefits by being back in the ecosystem, part of the functioning system once again. And you know, other animals that are coming back to England now, the white-tailed eagle, we issued licenses last year for chicks to be collected in Scotland and to be brought south for release on the Isle of Wight. And that was the first year last year of a multi-year program to try and re-establish that species. And there are others which, you know, are either coming back on their own, or as a result of historic efforts are beginning to recolonize. And the crane is one good example of a bird that's nesting just outside the city of Cambridge now, which, you know, when I moved here 30 years ago, I never would have dreamt we'd have cranes back. But as a result of some people trying to bring these animals back to the country, and now there being a decent amount of habitat as a result of some habitat restoration work that's going on, then these things are beginning to breed once more. And that is, I think, hugely encouraging.
Are you, as Natural England, are you actually involved in most of these reintroductions?
Well, so we have different roles in life, and as the country's conservation advisor, you know, we can bring people together, and we can provide guidance, and we can help to build partnerships. But we do have some legal functions as well. And I mentioned the licenses we issued for the reintroduction of white-tailed eagle. Some species require a permit issued by us before you can undertake certain kinds of management. And the beaver is another one, actually, where we've just completed a 5-year trial with the Devon Wildlife Trust, and are now looking at the data derived from that to advise government on what we should do next. And certainly my personal view from everything I've seen is that the beaver would be a very positive reintroduction. It would need to be done carefully with the right kinds of management options in place if they do cause problems, but those kinds of issues, I think we can work with those. And that's one example of where we have a legal role. And you know, it's a mixture really of functions that we discharge, and it ranges from the very soft in terms of, you know, working with people to discuss what we know in terms of the science, through to a pretty hard-nosed legal route, where, you know, obviously we have to reflect the legislation that's been laid out in European directives and in domestic law. And sometimes that's quite complicated.
I've been doing some research on Natural England last few days. I mean, I've kind of been aware of Natural England, obviously, all my the previous sort of incarnations, all my kind of life within this sector. I've been seeing a lot of negativity directed towards the organisation. What I'd like to learn now is basically what is English Natural England about? I couldn't say English nature. What is Natural England about? Because I've looked online and I can see that, you know, it's all about access and rights of way, land management, landscape, parks, trails and nature reserves, protected sites and species, recreation, wildlife and habitat conservation, publications, maps and data. But what does that mean to someone, you know, on the street? What do you do? What's the actual...
Yeah, well, this is part of the challenge, and I think you just touched on it there, David, in terms of how we communicate what we're about, because it is an enormous, sprawling range of different duties and powers and functions that we discharge. But if you step back from all of the detail, there's basically three things that really kind of summarize it. So one is the fact that we're the country's conservation advisor. So when government is writing policy, as they are right now, for example, on agriculture, post the European Union, and the Common Agricultural Policy being replaced by a domestic farm policy, we're advising government there on how to make the best of this idea of public money for public goods. So most of this country is farmed one way or the other, and if we do want to bring species back and reverse the decline of wildlife, we have to have a good farm policy. And so we're advising government on how to do that. And that's a good example of where we feed in and we give that kind of technical and scientific input to ministers and to departments. We do a lot of that. We've got a lot of specialist people who do that work. And then we're a regulator. And so a couple of the things I've mentioned already, actually, that we have a legal role in. One is issuing licenses for wildlife management. So much of our wildlife is protected, but there are times when certain interventions are deemed necessary or desirable. And so in relation to, you know, building of infrastructure, HS2 is a hot topic at the moment. When government decides, and it's the government that decides to build that railway, then we have to issue the licenses to ensure that it is done in a way that complies with the legislation. So, you know, that relating to bats, for example, and to make sure that contractors are doing the right thing as they disturb bat habitat. And so that's where we then have this quite technical but legal role in relation to the laws protecting those animals. And then the designation of national nature reserves, the notification of sites of special scientific interest, making recommendations on the siting of special protection areas under the Birds Directive, the review of boundaries of national parks and areas of outstanding natural beauty, plus the designation of new areas of outstanding natural beauty and national parks, plus the access side. So there's a whole raft of really quite demanding technical legal stuff that it's our job through the law to implement. And then on top of that, the third bit is that we are a government delivery body. So when the government decides to do something, they will say to Natural England, could you please undertake this policy for us? So at the moment, there is a new peatland policy being drafted for England to recover the health of peatlands for reasons of carbon and hydrology and biodiversity. And it would be very likely that Natural England will be asked to play some role in delivering that on the ground. And then we would go off and work with landowners and others to try and encourage the right kind of management to restore those peat ecosystems. So that's the kind of, you know, the broad kind of three big buckets. But as I say, within that, there are literally 400 legal powers and duties, plus other things that we from time to time get asked to do by government. So it's not an easy thing to explain. And of course, being we're not in the voluntary sector, we're a government agency. And so we don't tend to have the kind of, you know, brand that the likes of the Rspb or the National Trust would have, because, you know, we're part of Her Majesty's government machinery, and so operate in a slightly different way when it comes to our public face, which actually makes it quite hard for us to communicate what we're doing, as you explained a moment ago, David, because it is bloody complicated. There's so much. But in the end, you know, and this is what I always revert to when I'm confronted with complicated decisions and complicated challenges that we have to deal with, is that the general purpose is set out in law is for the conservation and enhancement of the natural environment in England, for public benefit for future generations, and to be doing that in the context of sustainable development. And you know, that sustainable development bit is where quite a lot of the negativity comes from, in terms of, well, why are you allowing this or why are you allowing that? And usually it's not us allowing anything, it's decisions that have been made by government that we then have a legal duty to implement or to help implement, including through licensing. So that's not a very short answer to a very good question, but hopefully sheds a little bit of light on the complexity of it.
Yeah, so you are basically the guys the government send out to deliver whatever they deem, which obviously puts you in the firing line. I mean, I've looked at you know, natural England and its, you know, previous incarnations, and have noticed that, you know, you've suffered from a massive slash in budgets and staff, which obviously must weaken anything you have a lot. Yeah. But I think, you know, of the things you talked about, it seems like the wildlife management area, that's the one that is the real sort of, you know, litmus paper in terms of people's reactions.
Yeah.
You talked about HS2 briefly. I mean, you know, we've been hearing, we being people, you know, I know and plus seen on Twitter about the fact that that's been going ahead whilst everyone's been in lockdown. And I've seen footage on Twitter of people walking up and saying to people, hang on a minute, you work for HS2, what you're doing, cut this wood down, there's birds breeding here. And to them, and then that person saying, actually, I can't comment, it's got to be someone senior. I mean, that's such a very vexed subject. I'm sure people here might want to talk about it, but what's your view on that in terms of how that's going, or can you have a view on that?
Well, I can have a personal view, but my personal views increasingly, you know, it's difficult to share them on the grounds that I have a professional view. And the professional view is a scientific and legal one. And to that extent, you know, we have a pretty constrained set of roles that we play in something like that. And so, you know, the various people I know have been mentioning, you know, bird nests being damaged and everything else. But that is a matter for the police. It's not one for Natural England even. And so, you know, we issue the licenses, and if there is a breach of those licenses, then it's a matter for the police side of things rather than for us. So we do have some enforcement powers on sites of special scientific interest and breaching of rules in relation to those. But in relation to HS2, the government has given permission to damage those sites of special scientific interest through a perfectly legal route. And indeed, campaigners have challenged HS2 and the government on the legality of the scheme. And so far, the courts have said that it is legal. And I don't have a view on that one way or the other, but just observe the way the conversation has been going. And so, you know, actually, I'll tell you what, David, you know, I spent a lot of my time as a campaigner, including at Friends of the Earth over many years. And it always struck me that, yes, you know, it's important to draw attention to the damaging effects of a particular project or a particular scheme. But actually, at the end of the day, it was generally the law which was deficient. And, you know, if we are going to go forward into the future with a stronger regime for the protection of the natural environment, then it's legislation that is a big part of that. And happily, you know, we have an environment bill going through Parliament at the moment. I'm not sure that would make much difference in relation to schemes like that one. But, you know, we're on a journey, and that journey in the end is one that is in large part framed by the legal codes. And so those legal codes don't change just because I'm chairman of Natural England. Those legal codes have been set down through successive acts of Parliament and European directives going back for 70 years in the case of the domestic legislation. And, you know, if people are very unhappy about the decisions that are being made, I would encourage, you know, paying some attention to that side of things, as well as the individual decisions, which I say are very important and people quite rightly express concerns about them. But when it comes to what we at Natural England can and can't do, we're working within a legal framework that basically defines pretty clearly where the boundaries are for us.
So where does the average member of public, how does an average member of public change anything then? It seems like it's very difficult to get any change.
It is hard. And so, you know, people go out, they run campaigns and they make their case. And very often, you know, that does work. And so, you know, this time last year, we had the British government change its climate change policy from an 80% cut by 2050 to have an emissions net zero policy by 2050. And that, I would say, is a direct result of people campaigning with Extinction Rebellion, who said, you know, we need to have a net zero target. So that worked. And, you know, during the time I spent at Friends of the Earth, I worked to try and implement the British government's interpretation of the Habitats Directive to some good effect. And, you know, those rules are being used now by people to protect wildlife. And another campaign I ran was in relation to the legislation protecting sites of special scientific interest that led to the Crow Act in 2000, the Countryside and Rights of Way Act. So, you know, that is a really, really important area to pay attention to, is the legal frameworks, not only the individual decisions, which people, you know, will express concerns about.
At this point, I just wondered if any of the Zoomers here would like to make a comment or ask a question. They all seem pretty satisfied.
Alan put his hand up there.
Oh, Alan. Alan?
Yeah.
Hello, Alan.
Hello there. Hello, Tony.
Hello.
I just wondered, you were talking about, or making the point that a lot of the places that are protected, nature reserves, SSIs are all or a lot of them are very isolated. Are there any plans to encourage a link up between these isolated places? I mean, there's this guy, Edward O. Wilson, which you probably have heard, yeah. An American professor,
yeah, I know him,
who very much pushes the idea of nature corridors,
yeah,
throughout the world, throughout the United States, etc. Isn't that something perhaps that we should have here? And that it sounds like your organisation should be, or could be, a vehicle for really sort of pushing in that regard.
That is exactly, Alan, the purpose of the Nature Recovery Network, to have this reconnection of good habitat across the country in order that wildlife can begin to move again. And, you know, this is now doubly important because of the effects of climate change and the way in which, you know, we're going to find animals and plants trying to move north. And if they're stuck in a tiny little reserve with the town between that place and the next place, which might be 40 miles away, it's simply not going to work. So the Nature Recovery Network is exactly that. And this is one of the things that over the coming year we'll be putting quite a lot of effort into, to be thinking through how we can do this reconnection job. I mean, some of the SSIs are so remote and so far away from anywhere else that probably, you know, to begin with, there won't be much we can do about it. But that example I gave of the Purbeck Heaths in Dorset is an example of where we, you know, there are some low-hanging fruit, where in some landscapes we might be able to go quite far and hopefully, you know, relatively swiftly. Another one near here is the Great Fen up in Cambridgeshire, the Avalon Marshes in Somerset, another one. Both of those multi-partner initiatives to try and reconnect areas of what are pretty fragmented and remote bits of habitat.
So are there like specific actions that are being identified? I don't know what habitat perhaps would involve, maybe encouraging farmers to do this or that, or actually purchase in some way, or are there specific examples to
all of that connection? Exactly, all of that. So if you start off with the ambition of reconnecting a fragmented landscape and to try and put the wildlife areas back in touch with one another again, the next question is, well, how do we do that? What have we got to help persuade people? Well, the first thing we've got is the SSIs and the National Nature Reserves. Those are blocks of designated habitat. And then in between, I'm hoping that the new farm policy will be a way of doing some of this, the so-called environmental land management scheme, to incentivize farmers to do, you know, effectively, you know, some kind of level of rewilding between areas of isolated habitat. We've got this very ambitious tree planting target, which I prefer to call a woodland re-establishment target. And one of the conversations I've been having with colleagues lately at Natural England is about how we might be able to target some of that tree planting to those areas where we've got highly fragmented ancient woodland, little pockets left. I was up in Northamptonshire last summer and just seeing a couple of woodlands that are really beautiful and absolutely still stuffed full of wildlife, but they're fragmented. There's half a mile of farmland between this one and the next one, and on the other side, a quarter of a mile gap of intensively farmed land. If we're going to be planting millions of trees a year, would it be good to try and target some of that between those fragments of ancient woodland? And I think that, I would say, yes, it is right to do that. And so if we can tie up the tree planting target with the new incentives to get farmers to do public money for public goods and to blend that into the Nature Recovery Network, then I think that's the kind of thinking that might start taking us somewhere. And that's exactly what we're doing at the moment. I mentioned the Environment Bill a moment ago that's going through Parliament. In that will be provisions for the establishment of so-called local nature recovery strategies. And so you could imagine, for example, in Northamptonshire, that at a county level, there would be a plan at some point in the future that would say that in order to implement the local nature recovery strategy, we're going to target these areas of river valley, of woodland, of grassland, and then to be building up the partnerships and the incentives to actually get those places turned into good habitat.
So would there be an obligation on local authorities to do that, or?
Yes, I think that they will be obliged to make local nature recovery strategies. Yes, they will. And we will obviously be assisting with that and helping them.
Just one final question to do with that. It sounds like you've got a really big job in that regard, but
yeah.
what sort of resources is there in Natural England to do this? How many people are working on this?
Yeah, well, this is David's point a moment ago, is the fact that during the last decade, every year, the organisation has suffered sustained and very substantial cuts in funding to the point that we are with a budget now, which is about half what we had 10 years ago. And as we've cut the budget in half, you know, the job has become much bigger. The pressures on nature are bigger than ever before. House building, food production, infrastructure. At the same time as we have this climate change emergency, net zero being very much about land use and trees and peatlands and soils, and the capacity that we have to do all of that work, obviously it's been spread very thin. And so since I took over as chair a year ago, one of the points I've been trying to make to ministers is the extent to which, you know, we are ready and willing to rise to all of these challenges and all of these government targets. But we're going to need more investment in nature to do that. And this is not about investing in Natural England to make it a big, flabby bureaucracy. This is a basic observation that the scale of the task cannot be met with the scale of the resources that we have. It's simple.
Yeah. To me, that's one final point. It comes across as if there's, in some sense, a strategic overview. There's a disjoint between a wonderful idea and the actual on-the-ground practicalities of this. Yes. There need to be teams in place that are focused on this to make this happen.
Couldn't have put it better myself.
I think you're very employing. We've got thank you, Alan. We've got a question from Claire now. Claire.
Okay, switch my video on as well. Hello, Tony.
Hello, Claire.
Couple of questions coming out of that and relating to a few of those points covered. First one I was going to ask was around the new farm policy and nature recovery that you mentioned. Are those effectively going to be replacing a lot of the grants that were available for conservation groups, environmental funding and volunteer groups? I volunteer for several groups locally, conservation, environmental, and they were pretty much run on EU grant funding to be able to have the volunteers, support the volunteers, carry out the project work. So are those two things that you mentioned going to replace a lot of that funding?
So the funding that will come through the Environmental Land Management Scheme, the most obvious place where you will see existing funding shift into the new funding is the countryside stewardship and high-level stewardship schemes, which are the current so-called agri-environment funding mechanisms. So if you're a farmer and you've got some land that you would like to improve for wildlife, the Natural England representative will come around and have a chat with you and agree that, you know, we're going to re-wet this area, we're going to put grassland here, we're going to put new woodlands and hedges in other parts of the farm, and then that will be costed up and some decisions will be made, and then that farmer will be paid for doing those works over what is typically a 5-year agreement. And so that's going to change, and we're still working through with DEFRA exactly what the new scheme will look like, but it's hopefully going to finish up being more ambitious than what we've had, and I would hope more flexible than what we've had. So one of the things I've had from many farmers over my year at Natural England is just how frustrated they get about the very precise and very constraining rules that as they see it, in terms of you know, you have to cut your grass on the 31st of April, and, you know, it has to be done in a very kind of, you know, rigid way. When they say, you know, some years, much better cutting it in early April, other years we might want to cut it in the middle of May. It just makes no sense for us having to do these very precise prescriptions. And there were good reasons for doing that when these policies were conceived some years ago. But I think we're moving into a phase now where, you know, that there's not only a different understanding about, you know, what we need to do for conservation, but also a different atmosphere amongst many landowners and farmers who, you know, like the rest of us, they're becoming more aware of the seriousness of some of these subjects, and, you know, many of them want to, you know, do more and do better. And so hopefully the scheme that comes will be, you know, able to be more flexible and able to accommodate more of that creativity and enthusiasm from the farming and landowning community. So, but that's work in progress. And, you know, hopefully in a few years' time, that kind of new scheme will be funding some major rewilding projects. And this nature recovery network I spoke about a moment ago, you know, that's where that money hopefully will be making a major difference. In terms of the volunteer groups and people working through local community networks and stuff like that, we used to have budget to spend on supporting that, and we don't anymore. And so this is another area where I think, you know, we could really increase the bang for the buck we get for conservation in the country if we had a renewed grant scheme that we could be using to support the kind of activity that goes on right across the country. It wouldn't require much money to get quite a lot of benefit. And I was actually quite shocked last year, actually, end of last year, I met a volunteer group who were working on an ancient woodland national nature reserve in Hampshire with Natural England, and there were 20 people in the local community. They'd been trained up to use equipment. They were very much enthusiastic and proud about their local woodland, and they were doing this work as volunteers. And then because of staff cuts, we didn't have anybody to supervise them anymore, and therefore they couldn't work anymore because of health and safety rules. And that just struck me as just being, you know, so it's such a sad, tragic waste of you know, goodwill, because for not much investment, you could unleash a really big amount of energy and work from people who want to join in. So hopefully in the future, you know, should we see Natural England enjoying some increase in its budgets, you know, the mission we've got, and which we've set out now in our new strategy, is called Building Partnerships for Nature's Recovery. And it's exactly about this landscape scale idea that, you know, there's no one organisation, no one community, no one body that can do the nature recovery network. It's going to have to be a participative, bottom-up affair, including working with communities. And so, you know, if we did have some more capacity to do that, I would very much welcome it. But I don't know how much of that will be coming from the new agriculture scheme, probably not much. And, you know, some good questions you're kind of implying there in terms of the large amount of money that has come into conservation in this country over the years from the European Union, and what will be the way in which we replace that. And the answer is, I don't know. Okay.
And just following on from that point for the HLS and the ELS, I've been involved in, again, local group, local council actually got a lot of HLS funding for an area of land, but it was the oversight that was lacking, because we're 7 years into this particular HLS scheme and they haven't met any of the criteria for that. But there's been no follow-up, there's been no checking. I think Natural England have been on site a couple of times, but they're not being monitored as to how well they're sticking to. And I know that there needs to be some flexibility, and I think a lot of farmers are very good at managing the land, and there have been some great ones, but with that one, it's just sort of, money's just sort of, they're getting the money, but they're not doing what they're meant to be doing with it.
Yeah. Well, I can't comment.
And again, I think actually a part of that is the lack of funding within Natural England to get the job done, because you just don't have the people available.
No, quite exactly. A lot of these things, monitoring of some of those agri-environment schemes and the monitoring of the state of the special scientific interests, I say, we are pretty thin on the ground. And so, you know, when you have that lack of investment, obviously there's a limit to what you can do.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much, Claire. Question from Amanda. If farmers change their land use to create wildlife areas being joined up, will there be access for the general public on the private land to enjoy the increased nature?
So one of the criteria for the public money for public goods is public access. And so recognizing the health and well-being benefits coming from access to the natural world, to qualify for the new Elm scheme, well, there'll be various layers. There will be a public access dimension, there'll be a wildlife dimension, there'll be a carbon dimension, there'll be something around landscape and the historic environment. And so all of these things will be reflected in how that policy goes forward. But the short answer is yes. I would think there would be places where, you know, you want to restrict access at certain times of the year for certain kinds of activity, you know, ground nesting birds and people going through with their dogs and things like that. You probably would want to have some level of restriction in some circumstances. But the intention of the policy, you know, if you are going to have public money for public goods, then one of those public goods obviously involves people being able to get out and enjoy the nature, as you say. So it's in there for sure.
Okay, well, thank you, Amanda. Now, there is a couple of questions I want to sort of highlight within the wildlife and habitat conservation section of the stuff that Natural England does. I had a look through today, and there's three things I want to quickly ask you about. One of them's very sort of in vogue at the moment, but anyway, I was looking at the license to kill or to take birds from for air safety purposes, yeah, and all well and good. When I looked at the species list, some of the species were red listed, such as herring gull, lesser blackback gull, and even lapwing. That's one thing, but the other thing I'm worried about with this kind of thing is that I've also looked at YouTube videos in the past and seen people out controlling pests. This guy was shooting gulls, and he was saying he was shooting herring gulls and lesser blackback gulls, or maybe just one species actually, but he was shooting everything. And I'm wondering, how did he recognize, you know, how could he have the ID skills to recognize them? Because even I struggle sometimes seeing a gull flying overhead. So as much as you issue licenses, how do you know that these licenses are going into the right hands?
So going into the right hands or going into competent hands, David? Because you know, the two slightly different things. So in terms of the right hands, you just put your finger on actually a really hot topic at the moment. So the lesser blackback gull and herring gull were both until quite recently on the so-called general license, which meant you could control them without any overall limit in terms of the numbers. The conservation status of those two birds has changed during recent years. We know that they're declining, and so we've made a much tighter regime for the legal control of those birds. And the thing that we've prioritized, because you know that you can control with a license different species for reasons of public health and safety, to protect property, or for conservation reasons. And so the health and safety piece is one that very often you would think, well, probably that is the most important. I was actually out on a field visit a few months ago and met with a very senior general from the United States Air Force who wanted to have a chat about birds and possible aircraft strikes. And, you know, he was obviously extremely sympathetic to conservation, but did point out the downsides of a fully laden Air Force tanker crashing into Cirencester as a result of a bird going into the engine. And so that is extremely serious. And that kind of thing, you know, whether it's a lapwing or whether it's a gull, you know, the effect is unfortunately potentially the same. And so people do set a pretty high bar there in terms of the safety side. And so if we are going to be issuing licenses for the control of gulls, for example, and recognizing there's all those different reasons why you might want to control them, including protecting ground nesting birds, then how do you allocate that quota, that number of birds that you think can safely be taken during the course of a year without further impacting on the conservation status? And so then, you know, we have prioritized the health and safety side just because it is, you know, it has huge implications linked with it. Having said that, you know, we are trying to be creative about how we use these licensing tools. And one piece of work that we are very pleased with is the cooperation that we've had with the Royal Air Force recently around certain airfields where curlews have been deemed to be a risk of getting into a fast jet engine and then causing, you know, a potentially nasty accident. And so what we've been doing with the Royal Air Force in close cooperation is visiting airfields in East Anglia. We've been removing the eggs from the nests, and we've been working with the Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust, and we've been hatching the eggs in captivity and then engaging in a so-called head starting program whereby we can get those chicks to the point of fledging and then putting them into places where we would like to reintroduce the curlew into England. And so that's a positive example of how we can try and pull together some of these challenges, including for red listed species. But it's not easy. And, you know, again, combination of juggling the legal side, the technical and evidence side, and the conservation side. It's a really tricky space to operate within. But, you know, and I wrote this the other day in a blog about our licensing work, you know, I don't think any serious conservationist would say that we shouldn't manage any wildlife ever for any reason without exception, and that everything should be protected and not killed. You know, that just is not a real world way of looking at things, no matter how regrettable it is to kill anything. I mean, I absolutely hate the idea of killing birds, mammals, or anything else for that matter. But there are times when, you know, management is required. And to that extent, you know, I understand people's concerns, but I would just encourage them to reflect on, you know, the complexity of all of this, the law, the data, the competing interests, and, you know, the extent to which not everybody sees the world in the same way. You know, there are people who have different kind of perspectives on wildlife, and, you know, some conservationists, you know, they control predators, crows and foxes, and, you know, these are beautiful creatures. I love crows and foxes, but if they're going to eat all the lapwing chicks in a particular area of wetland, you know, what do we do? Do we let the lapwing go, or do we intervene? Question mark. And, you know, as a conservationist, I just try to look at the big picture, and, you know, the crow and the fox, they're pretty common. They are beautiful. They're lovely, wonderful animals. But if it means that we lose the lapwing, the curlew, the redshank from lowland wetlands in England because we didn't control those animals in any circumstances, because everything was protected, is that a good outcome? And personally, I don't think it would be the best outcome.
Head starting is quite a contentious issue as well, isn't it? Particularly really when it concerns hen harriers.
Yes.
Now, one of the things I noticed in the wildlife and habitat conservation section were licenses to feed them on grouse moors. What does that mean? I've never come across that.
Yeah, this is an interesting one. So, so when I arrived at Natural England, I was quickly shown a document called the Joint Hen Harrier Recovery Plan. And so this is a group of organisations that I think it was in 2016, negotiated a joint platform for the attempted recovery of hen harrier in England. And this includes, as I recall, 6 headings, one of which is stopping illegal persecution. And you look at social media, David, you'll see a lot of activity there about, you know, birds disappearing and allegations of illegal killing and what have you. And so that's a big issue. Another one is linked to the quality of the habitat that they have. And one more is linked with the clash of interests, particularly on grouse moors, because hen harriers are very effective predators of young grouse. And during the season when the grouse chicks are growing, this is when the hen harriers are feeding their babies. And at that time of year, you know, if you're running a grouse moor for sport, you can find that your sporting potential in August and September has been considerably diminished because the hen harriers have eaten a lot of the chicks. And, you know, people argue about, you know, how big an impact that is, but, you know, from what I've read, it is an impact, and in some places it's quite a serious impact. And so when it came to that clash of interests on grouse moors, a couple of things were put in place to try and help resolve the conflict. And one of them was this idea of so-called diversionary feeding. And so the idea is that when the hen harriers hatch their chicks, you put a lot of food out for them, which means they don't need to go after the grouse chicks. And so people are experimenting with that to see if it might work. Actually, I've got a pair of magpies down the end of my garden that are just going through all the local blackbird nests. And I've been thinking whether I should put something out on the shed roof here to try and get them away from the songbirds. Alternatively, well, I'm not going to disturb the magpies. But anyway, you can see the effect of these kinds of birds when they have youngsters, hen harriers included. And they, the idea is that some research is undertaken to see if it's possible to get them to predate less grouse by giving them something else to eat. And so that's work in progress.
When you say diversionary feeding, what does that mean? Is it like red kites leaving out meat somewhere in the corner?
Yeah, exactly. So I think on some estates, they're trapping rats because the rats are causing problems in farm buildings and they're putting them out, amongst other things. And so, rats and mice that are being caught from pest control reasons might be one way in which you could, bolster the hen harrier's diet and encourage them to feed in other ways. But I don't know the potential, to be honest, David, on that. I've not looked at all the details and the data that people have gathered yet. But, you could imagine that some birds, they may not like to eat rodents when they've become used to eating birds.
Yeah, because I can't imagine harriers being scavengers, to be honest. But
No,
Jonathan here has got a question saying, but red grouse numbers are artificial and sustainably high in grouse moors, and it's not a balanced ecosystem, which actually came across when I thought, when you said what you said, I thought, there's many thousands of red grouse out there, many thousands, compared to a handful of hen harriers.
Yeah, so that's right. And so, the land in this country is largely managed for different kinds of human benefit. And so much of it is intensively managed to produce wheat. Wheat is not endangered either, but we produce a vast amount of it because we eat it. And in the uplands, people produce a lot of red grouse because that can be a way of making a business out of those upland areas. And the question is, I think, is about how can we make these legitimate interests as good as possible for conservation. So I mentioned a second ago the environmental land management scheme that hopefully can make farming in the lowlands and indeed in the uplands more sustainable. And hopefully we can find similar ways of incentivizing and encouraging people managing sporting estates to be able to do better for wildlife too. And I have to say, actually, that having traveled to some of the grouse moors and seen what some of them are doing in terms of managing not only for grouse, but also for waders, you very high population densities of golden plover, of curlews, of lapwings, and that evidently is a benefit. And from a conservation point of view, with those birds in steep decline, it's good to see that some of these sporting interests can be combined with the conservation of some of those species. Now, some people take the view that hunting is unethical and we shouldn't be hunting and we shouldn't be having this level of intensity on the uplands, and that's a perfectly legitimate point of view. But it's not a point of view that Natural England can take, because the legislation that establishes us requires us to work with all the legitimate interests. And a legitimate interest is one that is lawful and which is being conducted in a way which complies with policy. And, we can have discussions about the extent to which individual different bits of land in any part of the country, are meeting those kinds of goals. But I'm not going to take a view to say that, grouse shooting and grouse hunting is wrong, because, I recognise that the land in this country has got enormous amounts of demands upon it. And, some of those demands come from that kind of activity. And, for now, that is a legitimate activity.
Julia has a question here.
Hi, I don't know if you can see me because I'm not good with the technology. Am I
Can't see
visible?
you, Julia. We can hear you though.
Oh, let me try and see if I can.
There's a little video thing up the top sometimes, if you whiz your cursor up the top or down the bottom.
Yeah, we need to see your beautiful face, Julia.
Yeah, there she is.
It visible?
Yes, yeah, you got it. You're there. Yeah.
Hi, Tony. It's fascinating to hear about your work. It's really very interesting. But I'm just thinking we're living in interesting times.
We are.
In the middle of a pandemic, not to put too fine a point on it. But the implications of that are fairly scary for national and global economies. And I wondered if you lose sleep or have particular anxieties about the likely impact that might have on your work, or is that unknowable?
No, well, it's unknowable, but you're raising, the biggest question of all, really, is like, what does the world do on all these conservation and environmental subjects when we hopefully quite soon start to get to the far side of all of this? I actually wrote a piece the other day. If you do a search, there's a piece I wrote for the Evening Standard earlier this week, which is like, it's a 10-minute read, but is making some reflections that partly answer your question. Because the thing I say in there, well, I say two things really. The first thing I say is that the pandemic is an environmental issue itself, insofar as disease risk goes up as a result of deforestation, the wildlife trade, and some kinds of factory farming. And if on the other side of this, we wish to reduce the risk of these kinds of pandemics, we need to review our relationship with the natural world. That's one point I make. And then the other point I make is that with that in mind, we really need to seriously work hard to avoid doing what we would normally do in the wake of an economic crisis like this. And what we would normally do on the far side of an economic crisis is to deregulate the economy, to start growth as quickly as possible, and very often to remove environmental ambition because it seemed to be getting in the way of economic development. And, that did happen in the period after the financial crisis. You saw the rolling back of various regulatory and other ambitions for the environment. And my point would be is that on the other side of the COVID pandemic, what we have to do is invest more, not less, in nature recovery. And so that's going to be, a discussion that I think will probably begin to gather some pace over the coming months. And, that's the thing that most troubles me is like for an organisation like ours, an official body, like all arms of government, we've been suffering funding cuts. It's not just us, it's the army, it's the NHS, it's local authorities, it's absolutely everybody. But if on the far side of this, we decide that we have to cut this more in order to be able to free up resources to pay for the cost of the pandemic and to foster recovery, then that's quite a worrying prospect.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I just want to raise one more question on the whole idea of the species conservation stuff, habitat conservation. That is the decision made the other day to allow peregrine chicks to be taken for falconry. And the quote I saw was that it's a traditional cultural thing in the UK. That's obviously angered a lot of people. I mean, there's been many people I've seen that have been pretty angry about that. Yeah.
So there we are, David. You just put your finger right on it in the sense of there being a dimension in law that protects birds to say that under some circumstances, it is permissible to take wild creatures for cultural purposes, so long as those cultural purposes don't interfere with the conservation of that species in the wild. And so we spent a lot of time going over this, both from the legal point of view and also from the scientific point of view. And we reached the conclusion that it would be permissible to take 6 chicks from 6 different nests to create 3 breeding pairs to be used by falconers for a captive breeding program so that they would have purebred British peregrine falcons for the pursuit of their passion and their hobby, which is falconry. And so, again, I don't have anything against falconry, so long as it's done in a good way with the welfare of the animals to the forefront, and so long as it doesn't harm the conservation of those birds in the wild. So just from the point of view of, again, that legitimate interest point, and the fact that we have to work with all the legitimate interests, and this legitimate interest is recognised in the Birds Directive, it's recognised as a cultural activity by UNESCO. And so, it's something that we need to look at as a thing that we can permit, so long as the conservation status of the peregrine falcon is not going to be harmed. And so the conditions we've put into that license to take those 6 babies specifies that only the smallest chick can be removed from a nest with at least 3 youngsters. And we know from many years of very detailed research on peregrine falcons that quite often the 3rd, and never mind the 4th chick, they very rarely survive, or they don't survive to the extent that the first 2 do. And so the impact that this will have on the wild population of peregrine falcon is expected to be tiny, and to potentially be non-existent, assuming that those chicks do follow the pattern whereby, as is often the case with raptors, the last to hatch out very often has a lower chance of survival. And the other thing, just to mention in parentheses, and this is not a big deal potentially, but nonetheless it is an important factor, in the future, the descendants of these birds being used in falconry, should they escape and go back to the wild and breed in the wild, they will be British birds. And quite a lot of the falcons that are kept in captivity are different kinds of hybrids, different subspecies from different parts of the world. And so having those breeding with the birds in the wild in the country already, I guess from some perspectives, conservationists would say actually that's less desirable than having native British stock. And these birds do escape and they do breed once they've gone back to the wild. And so there's another dimension there. But if anyone's interested in looking at that one, David, there's a blog that goes into more details that's published on the Natural England website from Dave Slater, our director who leads on this stuff. And that was another one of these really finely balanced decisions based upon our best interpretation of the law and the evidence. And when it comes to law and evidence, I'm afraid personal opinions, we cannot reflect our personal opinions. We have to go with what the technical assessments say and what the legal codes say. And bear in mind, actually, the law is a really good example of a balancing act between all these different interests that exist in society. So I'm one of the people, I don't keep falcons, I don't think I ever will, but I really love seeing peregrine falcons in the wild. We've got them nesting right here in Cambridge. They're a fantastic bird. They're an icon of conservation, and I love looking at them. There are other people who think that, but also they have a passion for keeping them for these traditional falconry purposes. And the people who do that, by and large, they love the birds as much as anybody else does, but they have a different relationship with them. And the law says that that relationship that they have with those birds, it's legitimate and legal. And so that's the position. And, I fully accept there are lots of morals and ethics out there that don't get captured immediately by every decision taken, even though it's legal. And so, I'm sure this debate won't end here, no. But I would encourage people just to look at that wider picture that we're trying to work within.
I think the emotional response is A, what tradition is that? It sounds outdated. B, the fact that you may feel the fact that, what kind of signals that's sending out there to people who might go off and do it themselves anyway. And I think the other thing is, which I read that report and I realized that the question I asked as well was, why can't we use captive birds? But now I realize that some of the birds, or most of them, are not documented, so you don't know, where they came from. And
so I asked the same questions, David. All the questions that have been asked by the campaigners, I asked them as we were going through the final stages of this decision as well. And there was a great deal of scrutiny of this. And when it comes to the captive breeding of the existing peregrine falcons, quite a lot of the ones that we know are British birds, they've come into captivity by being injured. And so they spent the first part of their life in the wild. And those birds, and as I say, I'm not a falconer, I don't keep them, but we're told, and I'm told, and the people who looked at this believe this to be true, is that those birds won't breed in captivity. Certainly much more difficult to breed from those compared with a bird that's been hand-reared and came into captivity as a youngster. So yeah. There's additional kind of avicultural dimensions to this as well. But people will have different views about different activities and different sports, and those views are legitimate, and that's all part of the cut and thrust of debate, and that's how society decides what is a legitimate activity or not. And then in the end, that is reflected in the law. I come back to the way in which in our society, in a democracy, we do things. We do it in some part through legal codes, and at the moment the legal codes do say that falconry is a legitimate activity. Some people disagree with that. I can understand that, and I respect it. Don't necessarily agree with it, but I respect the view. But if people wish to change some of these fundamentals, then they they need to think about how that gets reflected in the legal process in the future, and that very often is about changing the law.
Okay. Jonathan's iPad here says, thanks for explaining that your natural England decisions are made within the confines of the law and different interests. So that's good to clarify that. Anyone else for any more questions before we just divert somewhere else and before we say goodbye? Anyone else? Okay. Tony, now's the pleasant part. And talking about a bit more about your past. So you and I met over 20 years ago, and I think you'd just written, was it the Guide to the World's Parrots?
Yeah, the Parrots of the World.
World, yeah, which I had a copy actually for a long time, but I gave it away to a florist.
Ah.
There's a gay couple florists in Notting Hill, and they were lovely to me, and he had parrots, and he said, I wish I knew more about parrots. And it was so nice. I gave him my book.
So I never saw it again.
I knew one, yeah. But you were involved in the conservation of a particular species of parrot. Can you tell us?
Yeah. Well, I was involved in the conservation of all of them. I was lucky enough to work at BirdLife International for a period in the late 80s, early 90s. And my job there was to try and stop the extinction of the world's rarest parrots. And so the parrots, it's an amazing group of birds, about 350 species, of which 100 back in the late 80s were deemed to be at some kind of risk of going extinct. And some of them were critically endangered, including the Spix's macaw. Actually, I wrote a book about that. I just reach up and fetch a copy down. This book came out in 2002 and is in some part a documentary of my experiences in trying to do something to stop this thing going extinct. We found the last one in the wild in Brazil in 1990, and as a result of that piece of work and some other things that were going on, a captive breeding program got going with a few that were left in captivity. And it seems like within the next year or so there may be a reintroduction into the wild, because that bird, when we found it, the population was 1. You can't get any rarer than that. And that bird died, unfortunately. And so, we were then relying only on the captive birds. But that hopefully will be a conservation success story that we'll hear more about next year as those birds are put back into nature for the first time in a long time.
Let's just hope there's a forest for them to go to, given the Brazilian government's
well, indeed. And one happy twist in that tale was that about 10 years ago, the forest where we found the last bird was bought and protected. So that is now a strict nature reserve. So there is somewhere for them to go. But yes, it's interesting looking back on that period, because, the conservation story often is quite gloomy. But as far as those parrots are concerned, the 100-odd species that we were working with then, I don't think any of them have gone extinct, and quite a few of them are doing much better than they were in those days. It's not a universally, happy story, but in some cases there's been some progress. And so it's good to be able to look back on that and to have some kind of detailed knowledge of that group, and just to be able to see that people have managed to do some good things.
Superb. What is your favourite bird?
Well, my favourite bird has got to be the swift that just turned up here over the last few days. We've got a nest out the back of the house, and I'm expecting they'll be back in there fairly soon. I've got a tape lure hanging out the front window in the street there, because I've got 4 holes that we built into the front of the house 15 years ago, and they've never used it. But I've never used a tape lure. So this year we'll see if we can encourage them to come and have a look. Because we've got a decent head of swifts around here. They're kind of semi-colonial, aren't they, in their breeding? So there's quite a few nests around. So maybe we can get a few more to come in. Yeah, and you got that. I love them. I just love those birds. They're just the most astonishing creatures.
Oh, amazing! And you got that amazing swift tower in Cambridge, haven't you?
That one's in Oxford, the Pitt Rivers Tower. Okay. But yeah, so David Lack's famous book Swifts in a Tower. That's what I grew up in Oxford, so I know that place very well. Over here, we don't have anything like that, but we do have a good population living. I mean, there's a lot of Victorian houses, and you know, in the places where people haven't blocked all the holes up with, you know, loft insulation, they're still able to get in.
What's your favourite mammal?
My favourite mammal. Well, actually, I was enjoying watching the wood mice in the garden the other evening. They're gorgeous little creatures, and we're right in the middle of the city here. And so seeing a proper wild mammal that isn't a squirrel or a rat, you know, that's part of the native fauna, that's always very exciting. We've got hedgehogs too, actually, but the wood mice, they sometimes climb up onto the bird feeders in the evening when it's getting dark, and they are the most exquisite little creatures. There's lovely warm brown fur with the great big black eyes. I think they're extremely cute. I like them. I do hear they climb up into the nests and take the odd baby bird though as well. So they've possibly got a little bit of a downside, like so many wonderful wildlife species. They do have other things that they influence. But we're lucky to have those.
Yeah, they're only doing what nature intended, I suppose.
Exactly. No,
finally, sorry.
Exactly that. Yes, exactly. It's all part of nature.
And finally, if you could be anywhere on this planet, notwithstanding the current pandemic, where would you be right now?
So I think one of the most memorable days I had ever out being a naturalist was in the Talamanca Mountains in Costa Rica about 4 years ago, up a valley at a place called Trogan Lodge. And it's called Trogan Lodge because they got quetzals up there, resplendent quetzals. It's about 2,700 meters above sea level. It's quite near to the equator, but up there, there are these massive great trees growing on the sides of the mountains, and it feels like a temperate forest because it's so high up. But it's a tropical forest, and being on a mountain range, it's just stuffed full of endemic species. And I think I got 20 endemics in one afternoon walking around there. Hummingbirds, different kinds of finches, flycatchers. It was just absolutely astonishing. I've never been anywhere like it. And that I think is a pretty special place, and I would like to go back there one day. Always conscious of the emissions coming out of aeroplanes, however, so save that for a special occasion.
I've yet to get there myself, actually.
Yeah.
You're a fascinating man, Tony. Let me just quickly tell all the other Zoomers that tomorrow we've got Lars Johnson, a giant in the art world. He's from Sweden. He's an amazing artist. He'll be talking about his work and showing us some of his work. Monday, Jonathan Mayrath is Israeli. He runs the Champions of the Flyway. So that's something that we'll be talking about, as well as the Birds of Israel. We're going to take a break for a few days, back on 18th of May, which is Monday. And we're going to have a whole week of travel. Kicking off with my friend Sasha talking about the potential of travel post-coronavirus, his view on what could happen. And then the following week, on May the 25th, Monday, we have the great Per Ahlström. And for those who are really kind of into that ornithology, his main thing is taxonomy. He's actually discovered or been involved in the discovery of 7 new species, and one of them was actually named after him. And he'll be talking about, you know, the fact of maybe there's more out there. So that's coming up on our In Conservation With series. I'd like to thank Tony for sparing your afternoon on this beautiful day. You could have been outside looking at your wood mouse, but instead
I've been out a lot today. I'm going to go out again now, so I don't feel deprived, David. It's nice to sit down for half an hour. It makes a change.
Okay, well, listen, thank you so much, and
happy to see you.
Stay safe, and for everyone else, thank you very much for joining us. You too, stay safe, and don't forget to keep looking up. And hopefully, I'll see you again very soon. Take it easy.
See you, David. Look after yourself. See you, everybody.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you very much. See you later.